there is a reef in the eastern Indian Ocean that lies so low against the water it can scarcely be seen at all, even in daylight, even by a sailor who knows it is there. At night, it announces itself only as a pale line of foam, and on a calm night, when the swell is long and lazy, even the foam can look like nothing more than moonlight lying on the sea. Onto this reef, in the small hours of a winter night early in the 17th century, sailed the newest, largest and richest ship of the most powerful trading company the world had ever known. She was on her maiden voyage. She carried a fortune in silver, a hold full of trade goods, the carved stones of an entire building, and more than 300 souls. Her name was Batavia, and the wreck that ended her first and only voyage was not the worst thing that happened to the people who sailed in her. That is the strange and sorrowful heart of her story. For most great ships, the sea is the antagonist, and the shore is safety. For the Batavia, it was the other way around. The sea took her hull, her rigging, and her cargo, but it spared most of her people, setting them down alive on a scatter of low coral islands off a coast that no European nation had yet mapped or named. And it was there, on dry land, among the birds and the shallows and the salt wind, that the true ordeal began, because the greatest danger the Batavia carried had never been the ocean at all. It had been aboard her from the day she left home, walking her decks in the clothes of a company officer, waiting. To understand how such a thing could happen, it helps to drift back to the world that built her, because the Batavia was not simply a ship. She was an instrument of an idea, and the idea was one of the largest and strangest that Europe had yet produced. At the close of the 16th century, the small, waterlogged, newly independent provinces of the northern Netherlands had begun sending their own ships around the Cape of Good Hope to the islands of the East Indies, where pepper, cloves, nutmeg and mace grew, spices worth many times their weight in silver once they reached the markets of Europe. The voyages were long, dangerous, and ruinously expensive, and for a few years the merchants of the Dutch towns competed against one another as fiercely as they competed against the Portuguese, driving prices up in the east and down at home. The solution arrived at in the first years of the 17th century was to bind all these rival ventures into a single body, chartered by the state and granted a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape. Its full name was the United East India Company of the Netherlands, and its people knew it simply as the Company. It could build ships, raise armies, sign treaties, wage war, and administer justice on the far side of the world, all in the name of trade. It was, in a real sense, the first great corporation in history, and by the 1620s it was the wealthiest commercial enterprise on earth. The company's power rested on its ships, and its ships were unlike anything else afloat. They were called Returschepen, return ships, because their whole purpose was the long round voyage out to the Indies and home again, a journey that consumed the better part of 2 years when everything went well. A return ship had to be a warehouse, a fortress, a barracks, and a small floating town all at once. She had to carry hundreds of tons of cargo, dozens of heavy guns and hundreds of people, and she had to keep them all alive through the storms of the North Atlantic, the heat of the doldrums, the long, cold-running seas of the Southern Ocean, and the uncharted approaches to Java. The company built these ships by the dozen in its own yards, to its own evolving designs, and each generation was a little larger, a little stronger, a little more heavily armed than the one before. The Batavia, laid down in Amsterdam in the year 1628, stood at the very front of that line. She was named for the company's new capital in the east, the fortified port city on the island of Java that the Dutch had raised on the ruins of an older town and christened Batavia, after the ancient tribe from whom the Dutch liked to claim descent. The ship was to be the pride of the autumn fleet, the flagship of a convoy carrying silver and trade goods outward, and she was expected to return in time, with her holds full of spice. She would do neither. She would never see the city whose name she bore, and she would never come home. her story survives in remarkable detail, better than that of almost any other ship of her age, because so many people had reason to write it down. There are the company's own records, kept with the meticulous care of merchants who counted every guilder. There is the journal of the senior officer who sailed in her, a document composed partly at sea and partly in the aftermath of catastrophe, when he was required to account for everything that had happened under his command. There are the confessions and interrogations of the men who did terrible things on those islands, taken down word by clerks with quill pens while the wind flapped the tent canvas above them. And there is the evidence of the ship herself, because after more than 3 centuries of silence, her bones were found again, lying on the reef that killed her, and archaeologists spent years lifting her timbers, her guns, her coins, and her cargo out of the coral, so that today you can stand in a museum on the western coast of Australia and look at the actual planks of her hull, still fastened together, still showing the marks of the Amsterdam adzes that shaped them. Few ships from the great age of sail can be known so intimately, from her keel to her fate. Few stories from that age move so strangely between wonder and darkness. What follows is her chronicle, told slowly, from the yards, where she rows to the reef where she rests, through the voyage, the wreck, the islands, and the long silence that came after. It is a story about ambition and craftsmanship, about the reach of a small nation across half the world, and about how thin the walls of order can be when a few hundred people are set down beyond the edge of every map. If stories like this one help you rest, if the slow histories of great ships carry you gently towards sleep, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel so that more of these long voyages can find you. And now, with that said once and set aside, let the story begin properly in the low wet country where the Batavia was born, in a republic of merchants at the height of its astonishing rise. The Dutch Republic of the 1620s was a paradox that the rest of Europe had not stopped puzzling over. It was small, crowded and half-drowned, a patchwork of provinces threaded with rivers and dikes, much of it lying below the level of the sea that pressed against it. It had been at war with Spain, the greatest empire of the age, for the better part of 60 years, first in open revolt and then in a long grinding struggle that had been paused by truce and had lately resumed. By any reasonable measure, it should have been poor and exhausted. Instead, it was the richest society in Europe, perhaps in the world. Its wealth came from water, from the herring fisheries of the North Sea, from the carrying trade of the Baltic, where Dutch ships hauled grain and timber in numbers no rival could match, and increasingly from the east, where the company's monopoly poured spice and profit into the warehouses of Amsterdam. The city itself was growing so fast that its rings of canals were being dug outward year by year, new brick houses rising along new quays, their gables reflected in water that smelled of tar and trade. Ships stood so thick along the harbour front that visitors described the masts as a forest. In the midst of this forest, on islands built and reclaimed for the purpose, lay the shipyards of the company, and it was there, among the saw pits and the steam of the plank ovens and the ringing of caulking mallets, that the story of the Batavia truly begins. The company's shipbuilding operation in Amsterdam was, by the standards of its time, an industrial marvel. Where most European shipwrights still built one vessel at a time, to plans that live mostly in the master's head, the company built in series, to specifications set down in writing by its directors, the 17 gentlemen who governed the enterprise from their chambers in the great cities of Holland and Zeeland. They decreed the classes of ships to be built, their approximate dimensions, the weight of their guns, even the carving that was permitted on their sterns, for the company disliked paying for ornament that earned no profit. The yard on the harbour islands employed hundreds of men in ordered trades, sawyers and shipwrights, smiths and blockmakers, riggers and sailmakers, painters and carvers, and it consumed timber on a scale that reshaped forests far beyond the borders of the Republic. Holland itself had almost no great trees left. The oak for a ship like the Batavia came down the rivers from Germany in enormous rafts, or across the sea from the Baltic lands, trunk after trunk of slow-grown hardwood, some of it more than a century old before the axe ever touched it. Pine and fir for masts and spars came from Norway and from the forests around the Gulf of Finland. Hemp for rope, flax for sailcloth, tar and pitch for the seams, iron for the thousands of bolts and nails, all of it flowed toward Amsterdam along the trade routes the Dutch already commanded, so that a return ship was, even before she floated, a kind of summary of the Republic's entire commercial world. The building of such a ship followed a rhythm as old as it was exacting. First the keel, laid down on blocks in the yard, a spine of oak scarfed together from several great timbers and stretching, the Batavia's case, well over 100 feet. From the keel rose the stem at the bow and the stern post aft, and then, one by one, the frames, the ribs of the ship, each one assembled from curved pieces called futtocks that had been chosen so that the natural grain of the wood followed the curve of the hull, because timber cut across its grain is weak, and a return ship could not afford weakness. Finding these curved pieces, the knees and breast hooks and futtocks, was an art in itself. Buyers for the yards walked the forests, looking not for straight trees, but for bent ones, for the place where a trunk swept into a heavy branch at just the angle a ship's hull would need. When the skeleton stood complete, the planking began. Double layers of oak on the outside of the frames, each plank steamed or scorched over fires, until it could be bent to the hull's shape and clamped and pegged into place. Between the planks, the caulkers drove twisted strands of hemp soaked in pitch, working seam by seam along the whole fast body of the ship, and the sound of their mallets, a bright, endless rhythmic knocking, was the constant music of the yard. Below the waterline, the hull was sheathed against the shipworms of the tropics, which could devour an unprotected bottom in a single season, and coated with a mixture whose recipes the yards guarded and argued over. Inside the decks were framed and laid, the massive beams supported by hanging knees of grown oak, until the ship contained within herself the layered spaces of her future life, the hold for cargo and ballast, the oar-up where cables and stores would live, the gun decks with their rows of square ports, and above it all, the open weather deck, rising toward the high-carved stern. The Batavia took shape in this manner through the year 1628, one hull amongst several on the stocks, but marked out by her size and by the role intended for her. The measurements that survive describe a ship of roughly 160 feet from stem to stern, broad in the beam, deep in the hold, and capable of carrying some 600 tons of cargo, though as with most ships of her age, the figures are given differently in different documents, and modern scholars, working from the surviving timbers and from the full-size reconstruction built in our own time, have refined and debated them. Whatever the precise numbers, contemporaries agreed on the essential point. She was among the largest merchant ships in the world, a vessel at the outer limit of what the shipwrights of her generation knew how to build in wood. Her mainmast, a single towering Scandinavian pine, strengthened with iron hoops, stood higher above her deck than the roofs of most Amsterdam houses stood above their streets. Her anchors weighed as much as a small house. Her 3 tiers of stern windows and galleries were carved and painted, and though the company frowned on excess, her flagship was allowed her dignity. And dignity, in the language of the age, was expressed in gilded scrollwork, in heraldic lions, and in the red and green and gold that Dutch ships wore like formal dress. She was pierced for a substantial battery of guns, and she carried them, bronze and iron pieces cast in the foundries of the Republic and beyond, because a return ship sailed through waters where Spanish and Portuguese warships, Dunkirk privateers, and pirates of several nations might all be met, and the company expected its ships to defend their cargoes. Some of her bronze guns bore the marks of their founders and the emblem of the company, the interlocked letters that were perhaps the first true corporate logo in the world, and several of these same guns, green with 3 centuries of seawater, now rest in museum halls, raised from the reef where they went down. When her hull was complete, she was floated and brought alongside for masting and rigging, and here another army of specialists took over. Riggers who set up the standing rigging that stayed the masts, shroud by shroud and stay by stay, each rope of hemp tarred against the weather, and who rove the running rigging through hundreds of wooden blocks. The pulleys, by which a few dozen men could manage acres of canvas. Her sails were cut and sewn in the company's own lofts. Her boats were built and hoisted aboard. Her galley bricks were laid. Her hold was ballasted with stone and gravel, and in her case, with something far more unusual, a building packed flat, of which more will be said shortly. The launching itself, months earlier, had been a day the yard remembered, because the launching of a great hull was always the moment when the shipwright's private mathematics faced its public examination. A ship the Batavia's size could not simply be pushed into the water. She went down greased ways on a cradle, restrained by blocks and tackles, and the calculation of her weight, the slope of the ways, the state of the tide, and the strength of the checking gear was among the most anxious work a master shipwright ever did. For hulls had been known to stick halfway, or to run wild and strike the far bank, or to strain themselves in the descent and carry the injury secretly for the rest of their lives. On the appointed day, the yard filled with people, the workmen and their families, the company's directors in their black and their ruffs, boats crowding the water at a respectful distance. And when the last blocks were split out and the last restraints slipped, the great body began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering, irresistible smoothness. The way smoking under her, until the stern took the harbour water in a long white surge, and she was afloat, alive, riding high and light without her masts and ballast, tended at once by boats, like a great creature attended by small ones. Whatever cheering there was, and there was always cheering, the shipwright's eyes were elsewhere, on her trim, on her lines against the water, reading in the first minutes of her flotation the report on years of their work, and by every sign that mattered, the Batavia floated true. Then had come the months of completion afloat, the masting by sheer hulk, the rigging, the lading, the mustering, until by the autumn of 1628 she lay ready in the roadstead, provisioned, armed and manned, waiting for the season's fleet to gather, and to the crowds who came out in small boats to look at her. She must have seemed the very image of her nation's confidence, a thing too large and too new and too well made to be anything but fortunate. It is worth pausing on that confidence for a moment, because it is part of the story. The Dutch of that generation had watched their small republic rise, within living memory, from rebellion and siege to riches that astonished the world, and many of them understood their success as a sign of providence, a blessing on industry and thrift and true religion. A ship like the Batavia embodied that belief. She was rational, ordered, efficient, the product of standardized design and disciplined labor, and she was setting out under the flag of a company whose books balanced and whose fleets sailed on schedule. Yet the age that built her was also an age of deep unease, of religious quarrels that split congregations and families, of plague years and war taxes, of fortunes made and lost in a season, and of strange new ideas that circulated in pamphlets and taverns, ideas about God and sin, and whether the old rules bound a truly enlightened man at all. The Batavia would carry both of these currents out of Amsterdam with her, the order and the unease together, planked into the same hull, and the voyage would test which of them ran deeper. But before she could carry anything anywhere, she needed a cargo worth the carrying, and people to sail her, and it is to the lading of the ship, to the silver, the stones and the souls that went aboard, that the story now turns. The lading of a return ship was a spectacle in its own right, and the Batavia's lading was richer than most. The paradox of the East India trade was that Europe wanted the goods of Asia far more than Asia wanted the goods of Europe, and so the outward cargo of almost every company ship was, above all, money. Into the Batavia's hold, under guard and under seal, went a dozen heavy chests of silver coin, 250,000 guilders worth by the company's own accounting, an enormous sum, enough to build a fleet of ordinary ships or to pay a regiment for years. The coins were mostly the broad silver pieces that Spanish America poured into Europe and that all the world accepted, and it is one of the quiet ironies of the age that the Dutch, at war with Spain, sent Spanish silver east by the ton to buy the pepper that paid for the war. Alongside the coin went trade goods and supplies for the settlements, and alongside those went a stranger cargo still. Packed into the ballast-shaped block by numbered block lay a complete portico in grey-green sandstone, well over 100 pieces of dressed and carved stone. A monumental gateway that had been prefabricated in the Netherlands and was to be erected in the growing city of Batavia, most likely as the water gate of its castle. The ship, in other words, carried a piece of architecture across the world in her belly, a fragment of a capital that did not yet fully exist, and the stones would end their journey not in a city wall, but on the floor of the Indian Ocean, where divers would find them 3 centuries later, still stacked in the pattern of her hold. There were smaller treasures too, and odder ones. In the great cabin, in lot cases, travelled a collection of jewels and curiosities belonging in part to private speculators, for senior company officers were permitted, within limits that were often stretched, to trade a little on their own account. Among these pieces was a carved agate cameo, of great age and remarkable size, a Roman work showing an emperor in triumph, which certain merchants hoped to sell to a great ruler in the East, perhaps to the Mughal emperor himself, whose appetite for such wonders was famous. There were silver vessels made for the same market, and there was plate and coin belonging to the officers and passengers. All of it, the company's silver and the speculators' treasures alike, would come to matter terribly before the story was done, because treasure has a way of proposing ideas to certain kinds of men. And the Batavia, as she fitted out in the autumn roads, was quietly assembling not only a cargo but a cast. At the head of that cast stood 2 men whose mutual dislike would help to steer the ship toward her reef. The first was Francisco Pelset, and he was, by the company's reckoning, the most important person aboard, though he was not a sailor at all. The company ranked commerce above seamanship, and so the senior officer of a return ship was a merchant, the upper merchant or supercargo, responsible for the cargo, the accounts, and the conduct of the voyage, with authority over the skipper himself. Pelset was a southerner, born in Antwerp, a man of the company's Indian trade, rather than its island trade. He had spent years at the Mughal court in Agra, where he had negotiated for indigo and cloth, observed the empire with a sharp eye, and written a report on its commerce that historians still read. He was capable, cultivated, ambitious, and by the evidence of his own journal, better at analysis than at command. He was also, as the fleet prepared to sail, not a well man, and his health would fail him at moments when his authority was most needed. The second man was the skipper Arjen Jacobs, a tough, experienced North Holland seaman who had spent his life in the company's service and knew the eastern seas as well as any man alive. He could carry a great ship around half the world, but he was proud, quick to feel a slight, fond of drink, and fonder still of nursing a grievance. He and Pelset had crossed paths in the Indies years before, and there had been a quarrel, hot words before witnesses, an insult that Jacobs had neither forgotten nor forgiven. The company, with the whole of its fleet list to choose from, had nevertheless placed these 2 men aboard the same ship, one above the other, for a voyage of 8 months. It was the first of the small administrative accidents, out of which the catastrophe would be assembled. The third figure came aboard more quietly, and no one gave him a second look. His name was Geronimus Cornelius, and he was entered in the books as the under-merchant, the deputy to Pelset, second in the commercial hierarchy of the ship. He was about 30 years old, a Frisian by origin, trained not in trade but in pharmacy. He had kept an apothecary shop in Haarlem, and the shop had failed. Behind him he left debts, a dead infant, a marriage under strain, and a shadow of a different kind. For in Haarlem he had moved on the edges of a circle around a painter of notorious reputation, a man tried for blasphemy and gross immorality, and the ideas that swirled in that circle, ideas that sin was an illusion. That whatever a man was moved to do was in some sense willed by heaven, and therefore no sin at all, seemed to have lodged deep in Cornelius's quick and persuasive mind. Whether he fled Haarlem to escape his creditors, or his reputation, or both, the records do not clearly say. The company, chronically hungry for literate men to fill its merchant ranks, did not look closely. He signed the articles, was rated under merchant, and walked up the Batavia's gangway with the rest, a slight, well-spoken, plausible man with a gift for making others feel that he understood them. Of all the cargo the ship took on that autumn, he would prove the most dangerous item by far. Beneath these three, the ship filled with her people, and the muster tells its own story about the world that made her. There were sailors, well over 100 of them, from every port of the Republic and beyond. Germans and Scandinavians and Walloons among the Dutch, some of them boys on their first voyage, some grey men on their last. There were soldiers, roughly 100 more, recruits for the company's garrisons in the east, many of them not Dutch at all but German, French and English. Young men signed on for 5 years at wages a labourer would pity, sleeping packed together in the darkest part of the ship. There were gunners and craftsmen, a surgeon and his mate, a provost to keep discipline, cooks and stewards, and there were passengers because company ships carried the company's civil society out to its colonies. A minister of the Reformed Church, the predicant Gijsbert Bastiens, was travelling to a posting in the Indies with his wife and their many children, a whole respectable household, transplanted whole. And there was a young woman named Lucretia Jans, gentlewoman of Amsterdam, sailing east to join her husband, who was in the company's service in the Indies. She was by every account strikingly beautiful. She was travelling with a maid, but without other protection, and her presence aboard, through no act or fault of her own, would become one of the threads from which the conspiracy was woven. All told, when the Batavia weighed anchor, she carried something over 300 souls, the exact count differing a little from list to list. Men, women and children layered by rank and fortune into a wooden world 160 feet long, about to be sealed together for the better part of a year. How they had all come to be there is a story in itself, and a soberer one than the recruiting posters of any age admit. The company's appetite for men was enormous and never satisfied, for the Eastern Service consumed its servants at a rate the directors knew precisely, and published never. Of the men who sailed east in the company's ships across its whole long history, only a minority ever saw the Netherlands again, the rest claimed by shipwreck, war, and above all, by the fevers of the tropics. Dutchmen with prospects therefore avoided the service, and the company's ships filled from the bottom of fortune's barrel with the young, the landless, the indebted, and the foreign. Around the East India House in Amsterdam there flourished a whole economy of enlistment, boarding house keepers, called by the grim popular name of soul sellers, who lodged penniless men on credit against their signing on, sold them their sea kit at ruinous prices, and took a lien on their future wages. So that many a soldier or sailor went aboard already, owing a year's pay for the privilege of risking his life. Muster day at the East India House was a crush of such men. The clerks who entered their names asked few questions, which is how a bankrupt apothecary with a shadowed reputation could be rated a senior merchant, and how the lower decks came to hold their quiet scatter of men who had particular reasons for putting the horizon between themselves and home. It would be wrong to paint the whole company so darkly. There were steady careerists aboard, craftsmen bettering themselves, respectable families like the predicants, boys with genuine dreams of the East. But the Batavia, like every returned ship, carried below her waterline of rank a great weight of the desperate and the disappointed, men with little to lose and much to resent, and the plot that was to come would find its recruits precisely there, because it was looking for them. And because the company's own machinery had gathered them so conveniently in one hull, before the voyage begins it is worth walking the ship once, slowly, from her bowsprit to her stern lanterns, because the Batavia herself is the protagonist of this chronicle, and she deserves a portrait. Approach her then, as a visitor in a hired boat might have done in the last days of October 1628, as she lay at anchor off the island of Texel, where the deep-water fleets of Holland gathered to catch their wind. From a distance, she is a castle afloat, her hull rising in long black and ochre bands, the curve of her sheer sweeping up toward bow and stern. Her bowsprit alone is the size of a smaller ship's mast, steeved up at a bold angle and carrying beneath it a carved lion, the Red Lion of Holland, leaping out over the water with its tongue and gilding catching the light. Behind the beakhead, where the crew's rough latrines hang over the sea, the forecastle rises, and behind that the long waist of the ship lies comparatively low, crossed by gangways, crowded with the boats stowed on the spare spars, the spare anchors lashed along the rails, the pens where pigs and sheep and hens complain about the weather. Then the ship begins to climb. Deck rises upon deck toward the stern, the half deck, the quarter deck, the poop, each shorter than the one below, so that the after part of the ship stands up like a wooden hill, and set into its face, tier upon tier, are the leaded windows of the cabins, and above them the carved and painted taffrail, and at the very summit the great lanterns of gilded copper, each big enough for a man to stand inside, which will burn at night to gather the fleet. Above the hull rises the machinery that will move all this across the world, and it repays a slow upward look. 3 masts she carries, and the bowsprit makes a kind of 4th. The fore and main masts are square-rigged, each crossed by great yards from which the courses, the largest sails, hang, with topsails above them, and above those small topgallants for fine weather, while the mizzen aft carries the old triangular lateen that helps her steer, and under the bowsprit spreads the spritsail that balances her head. In full commission, she can set a cloud of canvas measured in thousands of square feet, and yet the Age's rig is designed above all to be divisible, sail by sail and reef by reef, so that the same ship that carries towering pyramids of cloth in the trades can strip herself to a few storm sails in an hour when the glass falls. Every one of those operations is human muscle, organised by rope. There is no wheel. Ships of her generation steer by the whipstaff, a vertical lever below the poop by which the helmsman, watching the compass in its binnacle, and feeling the ship through the staff, tilts the great tiller a few degrees either way, and in heavy weather relieving tackles and extra men take over from him entirely. Orders travel by voice and boatswain's call. The crew works in the rigging without harness of any kind, laying out along foot ropes beneath the yards 100 feet over the deck or the sea, fisting canvas in the dark, with the mast describing slow circles against the stars. And the whole apparatus, hull, spars, cordage and cloth, is kept alive by ceaseless maintenance, tarring, greasing, splicing and sewing, for the sea begins dismantling a ship on the day she is launched and never once pauses. Sailors reckon the great return ships, handsome sailors off the wind, ponderous by later standards, but well-mannered, and everyone who served in them mentions the sound, the deep working groan of a wooden giant under way, timbers, masts and miles of hemp all speaking together, a sound that the people of the Batavia would live inside for 8 months, until the night it changed. Within, she is a layered world, and the layers are the social order of the Republic made solid in oak. In the great cabin right aft, with its stern windows and its painted beams, the upper merchant and the skipper keep their state, dine off pewter and silver, and consult the charts that are among the company's most guarded secrets. Nearby berth the under merchant, the predicant and his family, and Lucretia Jans, in cabins that are tiny by any shore measure, but are palaces by the measure of the ship. One deck down, the petty officers and craftsmen sling their hammocks and chests in alcoves of relative privilege. Below them, again, is the gun deck, low-beamed and smelling of hemp, tallow and powder, where the great guns crouch in their tackles at the closed ports, and where the ordinary sailors live in the spaces between them, each man's world a sea chest and a hammock hook. Lower still, below the waterline, where daylight never comes, the soldiers are quartered in a deck of their own, so cramped that a tall man cannot stand, so dark that lanterns burn at noon, and so foul in heavy weather that the sailors, who despise the soldiers on principle, pity them all the same. And beneath everything lies the hold, the deep body of the ship, where the water casks stand in ranks on the shingle ballast, where the portico stones lie block on numbered block, where the bread room and the powder magazine are locked behind their bulkheads, and where the 12 chests of silver sit in the strongest part of the ship. Under the eye of authority and, as it would turn out, under the imagination of half the crew. Life aboard, once the voyage began, would follow a rhythm as fixed as the ship's own timbers. The day was divided into watches, marked by the turning of the half-hour glass and the striking of the bell, and the crew was divided likewise, so that at any hour of the day or night, half the ship's people were on duty, trimming sail, manning the pumps, standing lookout, scrubbing, splicing, serving the endless apprenticeship of the sea. Food was issued by strict scale, salt meat and dried peas, beans and barley, ship's biscuit hard enough to knock on, cheese while it lasted, and beer while it lasted too, for the water in the casks turned green and evil within weeks, and beer, then wine, then finally reluctant water were drunk in that descending order of trust. Fire was the great terror, and the galley fire was the only flame permitted outside the lanterns. The cook and his mates fed hundreds from coppers set in brick, and on stormy days they fed them nothing hot at all. Sunday brought prayers, the predicant preaching to a congregation, ranked on deck by station, sailors to leeward, officers aft, the words of the psalms going up into the rigging with the spray. Punishments, when they came, were public and bodily, floggings at the mast, fines against wages, keel-hauling for the worst offences, because a wooden world packed with armed young men could be governed, its officers believed, only by visible fear. And threaded through all of it, in the dog watches when work eased, there was the ordinary human hum of the ship. Dice and cards played for stakes men could not afford. Tales told, under the boats, songs, quarrels, friendships, the small politics of messes and hammock berths. The whole warm murmuring life of 300 people who did not yet know that they were sailing toward one of the darkest stories of their age. She weighed anchor at the end of October 1628, going out over the shoals of the Texel roadstead in company with the rest of the autumn fleet, 7 or 8 sail together according to the accounts, great ships and lesser ones, with the Batavia wearing the standard of the fleet president. 4. Pelset had been given command of the whole convoy. The wind came fair, the pilots were dropped, and the low coast of Holland, that thin brown line of dunes which was all most of her people would ever see, of home again, sank slowly under the horizon astern. Ahead lay the channel where Dunkirk privateers hunted, then the long reach south past Biscay and Portugal, keeping wide of the coasts of Spain, with whom the Republic was at war, then the Canary Current and the northeast trades, carrying the fleet down toward the equator and the doldrums. That belt of glassy calms and sudden squalls, where ships could drift for weeks under a vertical sun while the water rotted and the men sickened. It was in these latitudes that the great fleet traditionally began to suffer, and the Batavia's people suffered in the ordinary ways: heat below decks that made the soldiers' quarters an oven, scurvy beginning its slow work in gums and joints, the first burials at sea, the body on its plank under the flag, the psalm, the splash, the ship sailing on. The fleet scattered and regathered, as fleets always did, signalling with flags by day and lantern by night, and slowly, week by week, it worked its way across the equator and down the coast of Brazil's longitude, swinging through the South Atlantic in the great arc that the winds demanded, until at last, months out from Texel, the lookouts raised the landfall every East Indiaman prayed for, the flat-topped mountain above the Cape of Good Hope, and the fleet stood into the watering place at its foot, the halfway house of the world, to rest and repair and take in fresh water for the second and lonelier half of the voyage. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what those first months at sea had actually been like for the people of the Batavia, because the texture of the voyage is part of the story, and because the Atlantic Passage was the school in which the ship's company, for better and worse, became acquainted with one another. A new ship on her first voyage is never quite a settled thing. Her rigging stretches and must be set up again, her seams weep until the timber takes up. Her people, drawn from 20 ports and 3 or 4 languages, must find their places in the web of watches and messes, and the finding is done under strain. In the Channel and the Bay of Biscay, the Batavia met the ordinary heavy weather of the northern winter. Heavy weather in a crowded ship is a misery that no account from the age fails to mention. The gun ports sealed, the hatches battened, hundreds of people breathing the same wet darkness below, while the ship labours, the animals crying in their pens, the bilges working their smell up through the decks, seasickness general, sleep broken every 4 hours by the pipes calling the watch. Further south the weather softened, and the voyage took on its long middle character, days of steady trade wind sailing when the ship ran for a week at a time without a brace being touched, and the ship's people came up into the sun, and the vessel aired and dried and became almost pleasant. In these latitudes the ceremonies of the sea were observed. When the fleet crossed the line of the equator, the old baptism was held, as it had been held time out of mind. The first voyagers ducked from the yardarm, or shaved and soused in tubs by sailors, got up as sea gods, fines paid in wine by those who could afford dignity. The whole ship given over for a day to a carnival that the officers permitted because wise officers knew the value of a safety valve. The predicant will have frowned, the soldiers will have suffered the worst of it, and somewhere in the laughing crowd stood men who within the year would be sworn to one another in an entirely different kind of brotherhood. The doldrums followed, as they always followed, the belt of calms near the line where the ship lay slatting for days under heat that softened the pitch in her seams, awnings rigged over the decks, the water ration watched, tempers shortening, the sick bay filling. Scurvy, the great killer of long voyages, did its slow arithmetic. The ship had left in autumn with her people already months from fresh food, and by the middle passage, the weakness, the swollen gums, the old wounds reopening, were moving through the crew as they moved through every crew of the age. A sickness whose cure lay all around them in the sea air, and whose cause no physician of the day understood. Men died in ones and twos of scurvy and fever, and the accidents of the sailor's trade, a fall from aloft, a rupture at the capstan, and the ship's routine folded the deaths into itself, the auction of the dead man's kit at the mast, the wages struck off the books, the plank tipped at the rail. It was in this same stretch of the voyage. The accounts suggest that the private geographies of the ship hardened, who dined with whom in the great cabin, which officers were reckoned taut, and which slack, where a man could speak freely, and where a steward might be listening. Pelsert kept much to his cabin, gravely ill for long stretches with the fever he had brought back from India, and his weakness left a space at the top of the ship's little state into which other men expanded. Jacobs ruled the deck, as skippers rule, and did it well, for no one ever faulted his seamanship, and the under-merchant Cornelis moved through it all with his agreeable manner, dining aft, walking the deck with the skipper, listening, always listening, in the way that would later be remembered and reinterpreted by survivors who had thought him, on the outward passage, the most pleasant gentleman aboard. The pause at the Cape should have restored the ship, and in the ordinary ways it did. Water casks were scrubbed and refilled from the streams that came down off the mountain. Firewood was cut, fresh meat was bartered from the herders of the country, the sick were brought up into the air. But the Cape also gave the Batavia's troubles their first open airing, and the trouble began, as trouble aboard so often did with drink. The skipper, Arian Jacobs, went visiting between the ships of the fleet, and aboard one of them he drank deep and behaved, in the words that survive, in a manner so loud and offensive that report of it travelled back to Pelsert, as such reports always travel. Pelsert rebuked him, and he seems to have done it not privately, merchant to skipper, in the great cabin, but before others, so that the reprimand became a humiliation. For a man of Jacobs's temper, already carrying the memory of that older quarrel in the Indies, already resentful at serving under a landsman, he considered his inferior in everything that mattered at sea. The public shaming was a coal dropped into dry tinder. Witnesses later recalled his fury, and recalled too who it was that drew alongside him in the days that followed, murmuring sympathy, agreeing that the merchant was insufferable, hinting that a man of the skipper's abilities deserved better than the company's leash. That voice belonged to Geronimus Cornelis, the under-merchant, the failed apothecary with the persuasive tongue, and it was somewhere on the long southern reach beyond the Cape, in the great cold-running seas where the fleet began to scatter, that the sympathy between the two men hardened into something with a shape and a name. Quote, "Though they were careful never to give it its name too loudly, The name was Mutiny. Something more should be said here about the mind of Geronimus Cornelis, because the islands cannot be understood without it, and because the 17th century itself spent a great deal of anxious effort trying to understand it after the fact. He was not, by the testimony of those who knew him, a man of obvious menace. He was slight, courteous, fluent, a reader, a talker, the kind of man who quotes and persuades. And the puzzle his interrogators later faced was how such a man arrived at such deeds. The trail they followed led back to Haarlem and to the circle around the painter Terentius, a figure notorious across Holland, celebrated for still lifes of an almost unearthly perfection and infamous for his opinions, who was arrested in the very year the Batavia was building and put to torture and trial for blasphemies that scandalized the Republic. The ideas associated with that circle, whether fairly or not, were of a kind that has surfaced in many ages under many names, that the enlightened soul stands above the moral law written for the common herd, that God works all things, and that therefore whatever a man finds himself truly moved to do is done in the deepest sense by heaven, and cannot be sin. In an ordinary life, such notions might remain table talk, a way for a clever man to feel superior to his neighbours. What the Batavia story shows, and why it haunted the moralists of the age, is what such notions can become when the table talk is carried out of the world of magistrates and churches and set down on a bare island where the talker holds all the food, all the water, and all the weapons. Cornelius's interrogations, preserved word for word, show a man who never abandoned the framework. Pressed to his last hours about the deaths he had ordered, he returned always to the same ground, that he had struck no blow, that what had happened had been permitted to happen, and was therefore meant a serenity that his questioners, hard men in a hard age, recorded with something close to awe. Aboard the ship, in the weeks after the Cape, this mind went recruiting. The method, reconstructed later from the confessions, was patient and fitted to each man. To the skipper he offered sympathy and the vision of command, without a merchant over his shoulder. To the young cadets of good family who travelled aft, restless gentlemen, adventurers with debts and appetites, he offered wealth and the flattery of being chosen. To rough men before the mast he offered simpler coin, plunder, freedom, and standing in the world to come after the rising. He bound none of them to anything at first. That was the craft of it. There were only conversations, hints, a testing of edges. Each man led just far enough to be compromised by his own listening. For a sailor who has heard mutiny proposed and not reported it is already, by the savage law of the sea, a dead man if the plot is discovered. And so each conversation was itself a recruitment, whether the listener consented or not. By the time the ship stood into the Southern Ocean, there existed aboard her, invisible to her lawful officers, a loose web of perhaps a few dozen men who were, in varying degrees, committed, compromised, or merely curious, waiting on events. Most of them, it should be said, imagined they had joined a scheme of piracy, a crime of property with violence at its edges. What the quiet man at the centre of the web imagined, the islands would reveal. The plan as it was later reconstructed from confessions was as simple as it was enormous. The Batavia was the newest and finest ship in the fleet, and she carried the fleet's greatest treasure. If she could be separated from her consorts, and if the loyal officers could be dealt with, then a determined band could take her, silver and all, and vanish into the vastness of the eastern seas, to live as pirates or to sell ship and cargo where no questions would be asked. It would need perhaps a few dozen committed men out of the 300 aboard. For a ship at sea is not a democracy, and a small armed group that controls the weapons, the officers, and the helm controls everything. Jacobs could navigate her anywhere on earth. Cornelius could talk the necessary men into the necessary frame of mind, for he had discovered in himself, somewhere between Haarlem and the Southern Ocean, a gift for finding the discontented, the greedy, and the weak, and for making dark things sound reasonable. Quietly, in the dog watches and corners of the gun deck, the two began to recruit. A boatswain here, a cadet there, a handful of soldiers and sailors bound by nothing more at first than grumbling and hints. and the first move of the conspiracy when it came was aimed not at the merchant, but at a passenger, because the plotters needed an incident, a provocation that would set the crew against Pelsert's discipline, and they chose to manufacture one out of the person of Lucretia Jans. What happened to her is set down plainly in the records, and it can be told plainly and briefly here without dwelling. One dark evening, well out in the Southern Ocean, she was seized on deck by a group of men with blackened faces, handled with deliberate obscenity and grossly fouled and released, the whole assault carried out in silence and anonymity, though she recognised by his voice at least one of the men involved, a servant of the skipper's circle. The purpose, so far as the confessions later made it out, was twofold: to avenge her coldness toward the advances of powerful men aboard, for she had held herself with dignity against unwanted attention, and to provoke Pelsert into harsh reprisals against suspects among the crew, reprisals that would make the ship ripe for rising. It is one of the small mercies of the story that the provocation failed of its immediate object. Pelsert, ill in his cabin through much of this period, gravely unwell with a recurring fever he had carried from India, investigated but did not lash out. Perhaps he sensed the trap, perhaps he was simply too weak. The conspiracy, denied its spark, had to wait, and while it waited, the ship sailed on alone, for by now the Batavia had parted company with the rest of the fleet, whether by the ordinary chances of weather or by the skipper's quiet design was afterward disputed, and she ran eastward by herself along the road that Dutch seamen called the Roaring Latitudes, with no consort's lantern in sight from horizon to horizon. She was sailing the newest and boldest route in the world. For a century, ships bound for the Indies had crawled up the African coast and across the Indian Ocean by way of its islands, a route of calms, currents and fevers. But some years before the Batavia sailed, a Dutch commander named Brouwer had proved a better way. From the Cape, a ship should drop south into the band of the westerlies, the great winds that blow forever around the bottom of the world, and run east before them for thousands of miles, making in weeks what the old route made in months, and only then turn north for Java. The company, delighted, made the route compulsory, but the route had a flaw, and the flaw was time itself. In that age, no instrument on earth could tell a navigator his longitude, his east-west position, with any certainty. He knew it only by dead reckoning, by compounding course and estimated speed day after day, and in the huge empty seas below the capes, with currents unmeasured and days of storm running together, the estimates drifted from the truth. A ship might believe herself hundreds of miles short of the meridian where she must turn north, and be already upon it or past it. And along that meridian, lying in wait across the very track of the turn, ran the low, unlit, imperfectly charted western coast of the land the Dutch call the Southland. The continent that would one day be named Australia, fringed for part of its length by reefs and island groups that a Dutch discoverer named Houtman had sighted years before and marked, with honest vagueness as a danger. The company's sailing orders warned of that coast. Every skipper on the route knew the warning, and it was toward that coast in the darkness of early June 1629 that the Batavia was running under a fine fair wind, with her skipper certain, on his reckoning, that open water lay ahead of her for hundreds of miles yet. The weeks of that great eastward run deserve their own quiet portrait, because they were the last ordinary weeks the ship would ever have. The roaring latitudes in the southern winter are a world of grey and silver, long ranks of swell marching out of the west with half the planet's fetch behind them, the wind steady and cold and enormous, and a ship running before it all day and all night in a state that sailors of the age described with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Gratitude, because the miles poured past as they poured nowhere else on earth. Unease, because everything out there was too big. The seas that lifted the stern and ran forward along the hull like moving hills. The albatrosses that hung over the wake for days without moving their wings. The cold that got into the bread. The Batavia ran her easting down in this world for week after week, her people muffled in every garment they owned, the galley fire, the one warm heart of the ship, the watchers changing in darkness at both ends of the short winter days. Navigation, in these conditions became the daily ceremony it always was, and the daily guesswork it always was. Each noon, when the overcast allowed, the steersmen brought the sun down to the horizon with their cross-staffs and fixed the ship's latitude, her distance north or south, with fair confidence. And each day, watch by watch, they streamed the log line over the stern, and gathered the compass courses from the traverse board and worked up the dead reckoning of longitude that was all the age could do. The reckoning was honest arithmetic built on estimates, and out here the estimates had nothing to check them against, no landmark, no soundings, only sea. And modern students of the wreck have pointed as well to the currents of that ocean, unknown to the men it carried, quietly adding their unmeasured miles to the ship's true progress. Day by day the little errors compounded, all of them, as it happened, in the dangerous direction, and the ship's pencil position on the chart fell steadily further behind her real one, so that in the first days of June, when Jacobs and his steersmen reckoned themselves with sea room to spare, the Batavia was in truth closing the unlit coast of the Southland at the pace of a running horse, every hour of fair wind carrying her nearer to the Abrolhos, whose name, the old story goes, came from Portuguese sailors' warning speech and meant in effect, "Open your eyes." The night of the 4th of June was clear, with a bright moon and a following wind, and the Batavia was making good way under full sail, her people mostly asleep, her skipper himself on deck for the middle watch. Sometime in the deep small hours before dawn, the lookout reported white water ahead. Jacobs looked, and what he saw he read as moonlight, the glitter of the moon's path lying broken on the swell, a thing every seaman had seen 1,000 times. He held his course. The accounts agree that the interval between that judgment and its correction was only minutes, and that the correction came from the sea itself. The white ahead resolved, too late, into breakers, a long pale seam of surf where the ocean swell was tripping and bursting over coral, and before the great ship could be brought round, she ran her bow up onto the reef at speed, striking so hard that men were thrown from their hammocks throughout her length, and fetching up fast, immovable, with the swell bursting against her side and her whole fabric groaning. She had found the Houtman Abrolhos, the low archipelago off the Southland's coast, at a place where the reckoning of her officers had put her, by the most generous reading, a great many leagues further from any land at all. Sen. In the first confusion, the skipper clung to hope. Soundings were taken, anchors were laid out astern, guns and heavy gear were heaved overside to lighten her, and the mainmast itself was cut away in the effort to ease the ship, though the fallen mast, tangled alongside, may have done her as much harm as good. It was no use. The tide, such as it was, gave nothing. The swell worked her deeper onto the coral, and as the sky lightened, her people saw their position plainly, a great ship broken backed on a reef in a wilderness of foam, with a few low islands lying to the north and east, bare humps of coral shingle without a tree among them, and beyond that, in every direction, the empty sea. The hours between the striking and that daylight deserved to be imagined slowly, because they were, for more than 300 people, the hinge of their lives, and the record lets us reconstruct them with unusual closeness. Below decks, the first blow had come as a sound before it came as a motion, a grinding concussion travelling the length of the hull, and then the ship, which had moved ceaselessly for 7 months, stopped, and the stopping was the most frightening thing of all, for everyone aboard, down to the youngest child. Understood in the body what it meant before the mind had words for it. Companionways filled. People came up into the wind, the moonlight in their night clothes, and stood at the rails looking at white water, where no white water could be, and the questions that went around the decks were the questions of every wreck in history. Where are we? How bad is it? What do we do? Asked of officers who did not know the answer to the first, were discovering the answer to the second, and were improvising the answer to the third. Pelset, roused sick from his bunk, confronted Jacobs on the deck, and the exchange between them, set down afterward in the journal, has the terrible economy of such moments, the commander demanding what the skipper had done. The skipper answering that he had steered by the best reckoning in the fleet, and that the land had no business being there, and in the strictest sense both men were right, which helped no one. Around them the work of survival began in the dark. The soundings, the boats cleared away, the guns going overboard one by one, each splash a fortune of bronze given to the sea, and beneath the ordered noise ran the other current that the confessions later mapped, men taking note of where the money was and where the weapons were. And what a broken ship and a lawless shore might make possible. Possible? And where in those same hours, the wind rising toward morning, the ship began her long dying in earnest, seams opening below, the hold flooding over the stones of the portico, and the first grey light, when it came, showed the ship's company their new world entire, and at a glance, and it was smaller and barer and lonelier than any fear the night had offered. Daylight brought a sorting of souls that would decide many fates. The ship's boats, the longboat and the yawl, began ferrying people off the wreck to the two nearest islets, and the order of the ferrying followed the order of the ship. Officers, women, children, the sick, favoured men, then such crew as could be carried, together with whatever water, bread and gear could be snatched from the flooding decks. The work was ragged and frightening, the boats overloaded, the surf on the reef dangerous, and it was made worse by a collapse of discipline aboard the wreck itself, where a portion of the crew, understanding that the old order had died on the coral, broke into the stores and the liquor and gave themselves over to plunder and drink, roaming the tilting decks in a carnival of despair. Not everyone could be taken off. When the boats made their last runs, there remained aboard the Batavia some 70 men, the drunk, the defiant, and the unlucky among them, by his own later choice and calculation, the under-merchant Geronimus Cornelis, who stayed on the wreck for days, some said because he could not swim. Some said because he was waiting to see which way fortune would break. Around 180 souls, men, women and children, were landed on the larger of the two islets, a place so small and so bare that a person could walk its whole shore in a fraction of an hour, and there they huddled among the shingle and the seabird colonies, salvaged canvas rigged against the wind, while the officers took stock of a situation that was, in the plainest terms, desperate. The water casks landed from the wreck were few. The islands had no spring, no well, no tree, no shade. The coast of the Southland, visible as a low blue line on clear days, was unexplored and waterless for all anyone knew, and the nearest help was the city of Batavia itself, on Java, some thousands of miles away across the open ocean. It was this arithmetic of water that produced the decision on which the whole story turns. The ship's longboat was a stout, seaworthy craft, capable, if handled by masters, of an ocean passage. The officers resolved, after searching the nearby islands and finding no water worth the name, to take the longboat north, first to probe the mainland coast for water, and failing that, to sail on to Java and bring back a rescue ship. Into the longboat, joined shortly by the yawl's company, went the commander Pelset, the skipper Jacobs, the senior steersman, a number of sailors and their indispensable skills, a few passengers, and among them, it must be said plainly, most of the men best fitted by rank and training to keep order among those left behind, together in the end, with a company of some 40-odd souls in a boat that gunwale deep was carrying all it could bear. The departure was not announced to the people on the islands. The boat stood away northward along the coast, tried the mainland in several places, and found it a wall of surf and cliffs and dune, dry as bone at every landing they could make, and then, committing themselves, her company turned her bow for Java and ran north through fair weather and foul for the better part of a month, to an open boat voyage of well over 1,000 miles that seamen ever since have ranked among the great small boat passages of history, worthy to stand beside the more famous ordeal that an English captain named Bligh would undergo in another ocean, a century and a half later. They made it. Every soul in the longboat lived to see the roadstead of Batavia, and Pelset, gaunt and fevered, went ashore to lay the loss of the company's newest ship before the most formidable man in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Governor-General Jan Pieterzoon Cohen. The city the longboat's people staggered into was itself barely older than the ship that had been named for it, a Dutch town transplanted whole to the tropics, canals dug under the equatorial sun, gabled brick houses sweating in the heat, a castle by the river mouth flying the company's colours over warehouses that smelled of pepper and cloves, the whole of it raised in a decade on the site of a conquered town and defended, in the very season of the longboat's arrival, against the siege armies of the neighbouring Javanese kingdom. So that Pelserd made his report to a fortress at war, and the man he reported to was the maker of all of it. Cohen, twice Governor-General, the architect of the company's Eastern Empire, a figure of granite conviction whom his own directors found frightening, capable of building a capital and of depopulating an island chain with the same steady hand. And not a man before whom a commander wished to stand and explain the loss of a flagship, a treasure, and 300 of the company's people. Cohen acted with his usual cold dispatch. The skipper Jacobs was arrested and imprisoned for negligence, and questions about darker matters aboard began to be asked. The high boatswain, identified as a leader of the outrage against Lucretia Jans, was tried and executed. And a small ship, the Sardom, was fitted out and sent south under Pelsard's command to save the people and Pelsard. The instructions were explicit, the Silver. She sailed within days of the longboat's arrival, but the return proved a torment of its own. The winds of the southern winter stood against her for week after week, and the navigation was as blind going south as it had been coming north, for finding a scatter of islands whose position was known only by the flawed reckoning of the ship that had died on them was a problem with no clean solution. The Sardom ran down the latitude and searched, raised the coast and lost it, worked offshore and inshore through days of squall and haze, and Pelsard's journal through this stretch is a record of mounting private anguish. The entries counting the days since the wreck, the calculations of how long the water landed on the islands could possibly have lasted. The growing dread, which he confided to the page, that he was sailing toward a graveyard of thirst, that the boat voyage and the governor's dispatch and all the beating southward would end at islands of the unburied dead. He was wrong about the manner of the disaster, as the world knows now, and he could not, but the fear kept him searching when the season argued for giving up, and the search would consume the better part of the southern winter before the low familiar shapes rose over the bow at last. All told, from the morning the longboat vanished over the horizon to the morning help returned, the people on the Coral Islands would be alone for more than 3 months. And they were not, in truth, alone with the sea and the birds. They were alone with Geronimus Cornelis. The first trial of the abandoned company, before any human evil touched them, was thirst, and it is right to give those early days their due, because people died in them, and because the manner of their passing belongs to the honest record. The water landed from the wreck amounted to a few casks among nearly 200 people, and the officers of the little camp cut the ration at once to a measure that kept life in the body and nothing more, a few swallows a day issued under guard, while everyone watched the sky. The accounts of those days have the terrible simplicity of all thirst narratives. The children suffering first and being given the little extra that could be found, the search of every hollow of the island for seepage, the experiments that castaways have always made and always regretted, for some, against all counsel, drank seawater, and some drank worse. And the weakest of the sick began to go out quietly in the tents. The record preserves the toll of that first stretch as roughly a dozen dead of thirst and exhaustion before the weather itself relented. And rain came through, squall after squall off the winter sea, and the company spread every yard of salvaged canvas and filled the casks and drank, and the crisis eased into mere hardship. Food, once the first confusion passed, proved the lesser problem, for the islands were generous in their own way. Sea lions on the beaches that had never learned to fear a man, birds in their thousands, eggs in season, fish in the shallows for anyone with a bent nail and patience, and the salvaged tides kept bringing gifts from the wreck. Barrels of bread and salt, meat, timber, cloth, wine, the disassembled fortune of the ship, distributing itself along the reefs. Out on the Coral, through those same days, the Batavia herself was dying by stages, and the people ashore watched it happen, the masts gone, the high stern working and settling, the seas breaking whiter and further across her each day, until in a night of heavy weather some 9 days after the striking, she broke up at last. And the morning sea was covered with her, planks and casks and men, for now came the reckoning of the 70 who had stayed aboard. Many drowned in that break-up, their names entered afterward among the dead. The strong and the lucky came in through the surf on wreckage over the following days, hauled ashore by the campers, and the little island's population swelled with survivors who had lived for a week outside all law, drunk on the company's wine among the company's silver, and had now to be folded back into a rationed camp. It was managed. Order in those weeks still held, but the folding in brought ashore the last and worst of the wreck's cargo. The man on the bowsprit spar, half drowned, revived, deferred to, installed, and the camp that had survived thirst now entered, without knowing it, the season of its real ordeal. And yet in those first days after the longboat's going, an observer looking down on the islands would have seen something that resembled order. It is worth pausing here, with the survivors on their coral shore, to take in where they truly were, because the place itself shaped everything that followed. The Houtman of Brolos are not islands as the imagination usually paints islands. They are the crests of a great reef system rising from the edge of the continental shelf, low platforms of dead coral and shell grit, few of them lifting more than the height of a standing man above the sea, dressed in salt bush and low scrub, whitened by the guano of tern and noddy colonies whose voices never stop. Sea lions hauled out on their beaches, mutton birds burrowed in their soil. The shallows between them ran green and turquoise over coral gardens, alive with fish, and the channels between the shallows ran deep and blue. In summer the islands bake, in winter, and it was now the southern winter, they are raked by cold fronts driving up from the distant Antarctic, days of grey wind and spray, nights that chill soaked clothing to the skin. Fresh water, the one thing above all that the human body requires, exists there only as rain caught in shallow depressions of the rock, brackish seepage, and, on a very few of the larger islands, in natural wells that no one standing on the shore could guess at. Scattered over this waterscape were the survivors, the main body of around 180 on the small island soon grimly nicknamed Batavia's Graveyard, a smaller party on a neighbouring islet where the water casks had been landed, and, still out on the reef itself, the 70 men marooned aboard the wreck, whose ordeal ended as the ship broke up under them. Many drowned in the surf, and the rest came ashore over the following days, clinging to planks and spars, among them floating in on a piece of the bowsprit, after days adrift, the under merchant Cornelis, who was received on Batavia's Graveyard as what he now formally was. The senior officer of the company present, and therefore, by the company's own iron logic of rank, the lawful governor of them all. He came ashore into a small society that had already begun to organise itself. And this too deserves its moment, because the ordinary decency of those first arrangements makes what followed the more terrible. A council had been formed, as company custom required, from the surviving officers and respectable men. Salvage was gathered and pooled, casks, canvas, timber, barrels of bread washed from the wreck and rationed out by rule. Tents were raised, the sick tended, the dead buried with the predicants' prayers. Rain, when it came, was caught in spread sails. Cornelis, taking his place at the head of the council, was in those first days a voice of energy and reassurance, and it is recorded that people were glad of him, this educated, eloquent man who seemed to know what the company would wish. What none of them could see was the ledger he was keeping in his own mind. He had been a principal of a mutiny that the reef had interrupted. Aboard the wreck, witnesses later said, he had even urged the drunken holdouts to seize the ship's remains and make war on the boats. He had every reason to believe that Jacobs in the longboat would either perish at sea or, reaching Java, be unmasked, and that investigation would follow and that the trail would lead to him. If a rescue ship came, it might come as his arrest. From this cold arithmetic, worked out in the tent where he had gathered the company's salvaged money and jewels around himself, came his design pieced together afterward from 100 confessions. The population of the islands must be reduced and mastered until those who remained were either his sworn men or too few and too cowed to resist. When the rescue ship came, they would take her by surprise, and in her they would vanish into the east as the Mutiny had always intended, richer by a salvaged treasure. The plan required, as its instrument and its precondition, the deaths of most of the people around him, and the record suggests that this troubled him not at all, for he was a man who had persuaded himself, with the help of those Harlem heresies, that nothing he felt moved to do could be a sin. He proceeded with the method of a man dressing a shop window. First, the tools of resistance were gathered in. Quietly and reasonably, all weapons on Batavia's graveyard were called in to central keeping for good order's sake. The making of rafts and small boats from salvage, which resourceful survivors had begun, was brought under council control, and the existing boats were secured to his own circle, so that movement between the islands in that country of channels belonged to him alone. Then the population itself was sorted and dispersed under colours of good management. The islands were crowded, he argued, and the water uncertain, so parties would be distributed to the other islets to fish, to hunt for seals and birds, and above all to search for water. One party of the sturdiest and least manageable men, the greater part of the surviving soldiers, was sent to the largest islands in view, the high islands to the north across a broad stretch of water under a Frisian soldier named Vibby Hayes, with instructions to search there for wells and to signal by smoke if they found any. They were landed without weapons, it seemed, and was meant to seem, a sensible use of strong men. In fact, as the confessions later made plain, they were being marooned. The high islands were believed waterless, and the expectation in the tent on Batavia's graveyard was that the soldiers would trouble no one again. With the boats in his hands, the weapons in his hands, the food and the money in his hands, and the fighting men shipped away over the horizon of the shallows, Cornelis had, within a few weeks of coming ashore, arranged the little world of the wreck so completely to his purpose that the people around him, sewing sails into tents, boiling seabirds, watching the northern sea for a rescue ship, had not yet understood that anything at all was wrong. He had also, in the manner of such men in every age, gathered a bodyguard, a circle of the willing whom he bound to himself with oaths signed on paper, young cadets of good family with appetites and no scruples, hard sailors, a few soldiers kept back from Hayes's party, men chosen with a connoisseur's eye for what they might be talked into. The record preserves their names and their oaths, and preserves too the chilling smallness of their number, though the terror that followed was the work of a few dozen hands at most, set over a population that outnumbered them several times, and it stands as one of history's plainest demonstrations of how far organisation, ruthlessness. The control of a few boats and weapons can outweigh mere numbers on a small island where there is nowhere to run. What followed on those islands, through July and August of 1629, is among the darkest passages in the history of the sea, and this chronicle will keep faith with the listener in the telling of it, honestly but quietly, without lingering and without ornament, in the way one reads the names on an old memorial. The killings began in secret and under forms of law. A man accused of stealing from the common stores was condemned by the council and put to death, and the sentence, whatever its pretext, taught Cornelis two things: that he could kill under colour of justice, and which of his followers would obey. When part of the council resisted a further sentence, he dissolved it, and appointed a new one from his own circle, and from that point the forms fell away by degrees. Men were sent on errands from which they did not return. Parties dispatched to other islets to fish or cut driftwood were followed by boats in the night. The sick in their tents, a burden on the water ration, in the ledger of the tent by the beach, were visited in the dark. The killings, at first hidden and explained away, became by late July open and systematic, carried out by the sworn men with blades and with drowning, and they widened week by week, until they took in not only men who might resist, but their families, the wives and the children, the predicant's whole household in a single evening, save the minister himself and one daughter, spared by calculation, forced to sit at Cornwallis's table thereafter. A small number of women were kept alive and held for the use of the leaders, and among them was Lucretia Jans, reserved by Cornwallis for himself and held in his tent for the remainder of the terror, a captivity she survived by endurance, about which the records are respectfully brief. By the end of that winter, of the more than 200 people who had come alive out of the wreck onto Batavia's graveyard and its neighbouring islets, well over 100, by the most careful modern counts perhaps 115 or more, men, women and children had been put to death, a toll to be spoken slowly and then let be. The perpetrators in their later confessions described their own acts with a flatness that investigators found more dreadful than any raving, and over them all presides the strange figure of Cornwallis himself, who, the records agree, in all those weeks never once used a weapon with his own hand, but sat in his tent among the company's silks. For he had dressed his followers and himself in salvaged finery, in scarlet cloth trimmed with gold lace, and governed the deaths of his fellow creatures as an administrator, by instruction, persuasion, and list. And yet, and here the story turns at last toward its light, the design was failing even as it seemed to succeed, and it was failing on the horizon, in the direction its architect least expected. The soldiers under Vibby Hayes set ashore without weapons on the high islands to search for water that was not believed to exist, had searched anyway, doggedly, day after day, across the two large islands that stand joined by shallows at the north of the group, and they had found it. On the further of the two islands, among the slabs of coral limestone, there were natural wells, hollows in the rock holding true fresh water, replenished from below, enough for many men indefinitely, the only reliable water in the whole archipelago. They lit their signal fires as they had promised, 3 columns of smoke, to say that water was found, never suspecting what the smoke meant to the men who saw it from the south, nor what their own island held besides. For the high islands were rich in ways Batavia's graveyard was not. There were colonies of seals and birds, there were fish in the shallows, and there were remarkably small marsupials, the Tamar wallabies that still lived there, easily taken and good to eat, so that Hayes's men, the party sent away to die of thirst, found themselves the best watered and best fed people in the islands. And then the second thing happened. Out of the channels from the south came the first fugitives, survivors escaping the terror on rafts of flotsam and stolen planks, men who had seen what was being done and had crossed miles of open water on scraps of wood to bring the warning. They came in ones and twos over the following weeks, and each brought the same story, told in the same exhausted words, and Webby Hayes, a common soldier of no birth, listening at his wells to accounts of massacre, grasped his situation whole. There would be no rescue for his people unless they made it themselves. The mutineers had boats, weapons, and the treasure. His side had numbers now, nearly 50 men as the fugitives gathered in. Water, food, and warning. What his side needed was arms and walls. And so, on that treeless island at the end of the world, the soldiers of the company set to work, and what they made can still be seen. They lifted the flat slabs of coral limestone that litter the island and set them into walls, shelters, and a redoubt with a parapet the height of a man, dry stone shaped by soldiers' hands, and in doing so they raised, though no one present could have known it, the oldest European structures that exist on the continent of Australia. Standing to this day on their low island in the wind, older than any house, church or fort, built by the colonists who came generations later. They made weapons in the same spirit, pikes from driftwood and salvage nails and hoop iron, clubs studded with spikes, a soldier's improvisations, and they set watches on the shallows and waited for what they knew must come. For the smoke of their signal fires had told the tent on Batavia's graveyard that the soldiers lived, and worse, that they lived beside the only sure water in the islands, athwart the channel by which any rescue ship must come, and Cornwallis understood, as clearly as Hayes did, that his design could not be completed while that island held out. The last act of the islands would be a war. While that war gathered, life on the high island settled into a rhythm that deserves a moment's attention because it is the one passage of the whole chronicle where something like ordinary human society, even something like contentment, took root, and the contrast is part of the story's meaning. Hayes's people had, by the standards of castaways anywhere, abundance. The wells gave sweet water without stint. The wallabies were so unwary that the first ones, the accounts say, were simply run down and taken by hand. The flats between the two big islands could be waded at low water for shellfish and stranded fish. Birds and eggs were there for the climbing, and driftwood and wreckage supplied fuel and material. The soldiers organised themselves as soldiers do, by watches and messes and shared labour, hunting parties out by day, sentries posted on the shores that faced the south, the walls rising course by course in the off hours, and over it all a discipline that was freely given rather than imposed. For Hayes commanded, every account agrees, by plain worth. They cared for the fugitives who reached them, some of whom arrived in a state that needed long mending in body and otherwise, and the little colony absorbed them, fed them, and heard their testimony, which each newcomer renewed and confirmed, so that the defenders' understanding of what they faced was never in doubt and never exaggerated. They knew with a soldier's precision what would come across the water and roughly when, for the water itself set the timetable. Cornelius could not leave them be, whatever the cost of coming. Every week that passed brought nearer the day a rescue sail might rise, and a rescue that touched first at a well-watered island full of witnesses was the end of everything the tent on Batavia's graveyard had planned. So the defenders watched the southern channels and dressed their walls and hardened their pikes in their fires, and waited with the particular calm of men who have simple work, sufficient water, and no illusions, which on those islands, in that winter, made them the most fortunate people within 1,000 miles. It was a war of the smallest and strangest kind, fought between a few score half-starved men across a mile or two of turquoise shallows, and yet everything in the story now depended on it. The mutineers came north for the first time in the last days of July, a raiding party in the salvaged boats, armed with the swords and pikes of the company's stores, and some accounts say wearing their looted scarlet so that they crossed the pale water like a procession from some grim carnival. They expected weakened castaways. They found instead prepared positions, watchmen who had seen them coming across miles of flat sea, and a disciplined reception of thrown stones and long improvised pikes at the water's edge, where men wading ashore are at their most helpless. The attack was beaten off without loss to the defenders, and a second attempt some days later ended the same way, the boats standing off at last while the soldiers jeered from their walls. Cornelius then tried the other weapon in which he trusted more, and the episode that followed is one of the strangest in the whole chronicle. He came north himself to negotiate, bringing wine and cloth and promises, proposing peace between the islands and offering terms, and beneath the parley ran his real design, letters smuggled to a handful of French soldiers among the defenders, offering great sums in the company's silver if they would betray their fellows from within. The soldiers took the letters straight to Hayes. And when Cornelius next came to the water's edge to continue the play, in September, by the accounts, trusting in his gift of tongue as he had trusted in it all his life, the defenders broke the truce of the parley in the only coin the situation allowed, rushed the negotiating party, killed the worst of his lieutenants on the spot, and took Geronimus Cornelius alive. It was an act of plain treachery by the formal rules of parley, and no one then or since has managed to blame them for it. The prisoner was bound and kept. A serpent in a box, while command of the mutineers passed to a young soldier of the harder and simpler kind, Wouter Loose, who wasted no time on letters. He came north in the middle of September with every man and weapon left to him, including, this time, muskets, which outranged everything the defenders could make, and the last battle was the most dangerous of all, the attackers firing from the boats and from the shallows, the defenders taking wounds, now several men hit. The stone walls proving their worth as the musket balls cracked against the coral slabs, the issue for the first time genuinely in doubt, and it was at the height of this fight on the morning of the 17th of September, 1629, that a sail lifted over the northern horizon and the war stopped where it stood, because both sides understood in the same instant that the future had arrived, and that everything now depended on which of them reached it first. The Sardom had come at last, and the race to her side was the whole war compressed into an hour. Hayes's fastest boat and the mutineers' boats pulling for the ship over the same miles of sea. Hayes won the race. He came alongside the Sardam and up over her rail and stood, ragged and salt-burned, before Francisco Pelsert, who had spent weeks of despairing search among the reefs and had arrived expecting to greet a camp of grateful castaways. And there, on the deck, the soldier told the commander, in a few minutes, what had been done in the islands. The numbers dead. The women held, the treasure gathered, and the boats even now pulling toward the ship full of armed men in scarlet. It is recorded that Pelsert could scarcely take it in, and it is hard to blame him. No officer of the company had ever received such a report. But he acted, and acted well. The Sardom's guns were manned, the approaching boats were commanded to stand off, their crews ordered to throw their weapons into the sea before coming alongside, and the mutineers, who had staked everything on surprise and found instead an armed and warned ship, obeyed, one boatload after another, the whole conspiracy collapsing in an afternoon without a shot, in the way of conspiracies whose single plan has failed. The arrests followed through the days after, parties of sailors and of Hayes's soldiers moving through the islands, the sworn men taken, the survivors gathered, the tents of Batavia's graveyard searched, and the company's treasure, the coin and the jewels that had been collected into the leader's keeping, recovered. Then began the strangest labour of all for Pelsert, as the senior merchant on the spot was now required by the company's law to become a judge, and the deck and tents of the anchorage became a court. Through the last days of September the confessions were taken down, under interrogation and, as the age's law allowed and the record frankly states, under torture where denial persisted, and the picture assembled, sentence by sentence, into the account that historians still use, each prisoner's testimony checked against the others, the dead numbered, the deeds assigned. Cornelius, brought aboard in irons, denied, then blamed his followers, then confronted with their unanimous witness, turned and twisted through examination after examination, admitting, retracting his admissions, asserting to the end that he had wielded no weapon and therefore bore no guilt. Bold a defence that impressed no one then and has impressed no one since. The sentences were pronounced at the end of the month. The worst of the murderers were to die where they had done their work, in the islands, and on the 2nd of October 1629, on one of the small islets, gallows were raised from salvaged timber, and Geronimus Cornelis and several of his principal followers were hanged, the leader suffering first by the sentence of the court. The loss of both hands, the age's mark for deeds beyond common crime, and the record sets down that he went to the rope, unrepentant, crying out that he would be revenged, while the survivors of the islands stood witness in the wind. Lesser men among the guilty were flogged, keel-hauled, or reserved for justice in Java, and two, a pair judged worth punishing but not hanging, among them the young commander of the last battle, Wouter Loos, and a cabin boy named Jan Pelgrim, were dealt a sentence stranger than death, of which more in a moment, for it would give them a peculiar place in the history of a continent. Those weeks of judgment at the anchorage have a strange, suspended quality in the record, and it is worth resting in them briefly before the story moves on, because they were, among everything else, the moment the two halves of the catastrophe finally faced each other. On the same few acres of coral in tents pitched within sight of one another, lived the survivors and the men who had made them survivors of something, the widows and the orphan children within call of the guarded pen where the sworn men sat in irons awaiting examination, and between them moved the sailors of the Sardom, the clerks with their papers, the predicant restored to his office, and burying at last, with words and rites, the dead of the whole winter as remains were gathered from across the islands. The examinations themselves, ground on day after day in the commander's tent, question and answer taken down verbatim in the formulas of Dutch law, each confession read back and signed or marked, each man examined again as others' testimony implicated him further. And the documents that survive from those days preserve small moments that no novelist would dare invent, prisoners asked to account for particular days and answering with the terrible bookkeeping of memory. Survivors called in to identify and confirm, and once entered without comment among the proceedings. The record of the leaders being confronted by the women they had held, testimony given steadily, the clerk's pen keeping pace. Through it all, the salvage work went on in the same lagoon, the divers going down over the wreck while the court sat ashore, silver rising from the sea into the same boats that carried the accused, so that the treasure and the judgment which had been joined from the beginning remained joined to the end. And on the morning the sentences were carried out, the record notes the weather was fair, the survivors were assembled to witness as the law required, and when it was done, the camp, by every sign the documents give, simply resumed its work, because there was water to raise and a ship to lade and a monsoon season waiting to the north and the age. Whatever else may be said of it did not linger over what it had decided. The sentence passed on loose, and Pelgrim was marooning, and the place chosen for it has given the two men an odd immortality. The Sardam, working north along the coast of the Southland on her homeward passage, stood in toward the mouth of a river in the country the Dutch charts marked only in outline, and there the two were set ashore with a small boat, trade trinkets, and instructions that read strangely gently in the record, to make contact with the people of the land, to learn what they could of it, and to watch for Dutch ships in after years, which were directed to look for their signals. Then the ship sailed on and left them on the beach, two young men from the towns of northern Europe, standing at the edge of a continent no European had ever entered and lived to describe, and the record of them ends there, on that shore, absolutely. No Dutch ship ever found them again. Whether they perished in days or lived for years, whether the people of that country killed them, shunned them, or took them in, no document says, though generations of writers have wondered, and some have looked hopefully at old reports from that coast of fair-haired or light-eyed people among the inhabitants, evidence far too thin to bear weight, as the careful ones admit. What can be said is only this, that by the accident of a criminal sentence, the first Europeans ever to become residents of Australia, years before any other, were a mutineer and a murderer from the wreck of the Batavia, left on a beach at the world's end in October of 1629, and that the land closed over their story like water. The Sardam's own remaining weeks at the islands had been spent in labour of a different kind, for Pelschut's instructions set the company's property only a little below the company's justice, and the wreck still held the silver. The Batavia by now was a broken thing, her upper works gone, her hull settling into the coral, but her strong room lay in water shallow enough for daring, and the expedition had brought men for the purpose, divers engaged in Java, said by the records to have come from the purling coasts of India, who worked from boats over the wreck through the spring weather, going down on held breath into the surge among the timbers. It was terribly dangerous work, and it was strangely successful. Chest after chest of the silver was slung and raised, 10 of the 12 by the final accounting, together with guns and goods, so that the company, which had lost a new ship, a fortune in lives and a season of trade, recovered the greater part of its coin, and the ledgers in Amsterdam, in their unsentimental way, closed much of the account. One chest was found jammed under a fallen cannon and defeated every effort. Another could not be come at before the season turned, and these, with the scattered small wealth of the ship, her everyday coins and possessions, stayed with her bones on the reef, a detail worth remembering. And the calling would eventually bring the whole story back into the light. In late November, the Sardam weighed at last and carried the surviving people of the Batavia north to Java, and it is one of the sober mercies of the chronicle that the voyage was quiet. Of the more than 300 souls who had left Texel a year before, well, under a third came into the roadstead of the city whose name their ship had carried. The modern reckonings, counting all who died by water, thirst, sickness, violence, the rope, put the survivors at fewer than 125, and every one of them owed the balance of their days to the wells that Vibby Hayes had found and the walls his men had raised. One can only imagine, for the record does not describe it, what that northward passage was like below the Sardam's decks. The small ship crowded with people who had shared the islands from opposite sides of the Terror, the remaining prisoners battened in the hold, among them men whose voices every survivor knew, the widowed and the orphaned berthed above them, the predicant moving among his diminished flock. The recovered silver stowed once more, as it had been stowed a year before, under seal in the strongest part of a ship, and the islands sinking astern into the sea haze, first the walls and the wells, then the little island of the graves, then the pale seam of morning reef, until the whole theatre of the winter was gone under the horizon, and there was only the ordinary sea, which looks the same after everything as before. The passage was slow against the season's winds. One of the ship's boats sent away during the salvage weeks to search a further reef had vanished entirely with her crew. A last small levy the sea took almost unnoticed amid the greater accounting. And it was December before the Sardam came into the roads of Batavia and delivered her freight of survivors, prisoners, and testimony into the machinery of the company's justice. Java dealt out endings with the company's usual brisk economy. The remaining prisoners were tried again before the Council of Justice at Batavia, and the guiltiest were executed there, while others were flogged or sent to labour. The skipper Arian Jacobs, already in the castle's cells on the charge of negligent navigation and under grave suspicion of the deeper design, held out against interrogation, admitted nothing that sufficed, and disappears from the record still a prisoner, his final fate unrecorded, one of the story's permanently open doors. Lucretia Jans, coming ashore at last after everything, learned that the husband she had sailed to join had died before her arrival. She remained in the Indies in time, married again, and returned eventually to the Netherlands, where the archives show her living out a long life that the islands mercifully did not define. The predicant Bastiennes, bereaved of almost his whole family, served the company's church in the East for some years more and died there of illness, leaving letters in which his grief and his faith wrestle on the page. Wibby Hayes, the common soldier whose stubbornness had saved every life that was saved, was promoted on the spot by the Governor-General's authority, made an officer with a gentleman's pay, celebrated briefly as the hero of the affair, and then, like so many of the company's servants, simply fades from the surviving records. His later career and his end unknown, so that the man who stands at the moral centre of the story has no grave, no portrait, and no biography beyond his one great season. And Francisco Pelsert, the commander, found that survival and salvage had not redeemed him. The company's councils judged, fairly or not, that his authority had failed at every point where firmness might have turned the story, at the Cape, on the voyage, in the decision to leave the islands, and though he was employed again briefly, his standing was broken, his health, never strong, gave way entirely, and he died in the Indies within a year of the trials. A man of real gifts, remembered chiefly for presiding over a catastrophe. His journal, sent home to the Netherlands, was printed within a few years with lurid engravings, and the tale of the Batavia ran through Europe as a sensation, was retold and embroidered for a generation, and then, as sensations do, it sank slowly out of the common memory, while the ship herself lay unvisited on her reef, and the coral, patient beyond all human patience, began to grow over her guns. Before following her into that long sleep, it is worth lifting our eyes for a while from the reef and setting the Batavia in her place among the great ships of her world, because she did not sail out of Amsterdam alone in ambition, and the human contest to build ever larger vessels, that slow rivalry stretching across centuries and seas, is the wider story of which hers is a single dark chapter. The ships of the East India trade were the largest working machines of their civilization, and every seafaring nation of the age was pressing at the same limits of oak and hemp. The Portuguese first on the eastern routes had built their enormous carracks for the Goa run, round-bellied giants that could carry 1,000 souls, ships so large and so overloaded that their losses became a national grief, chronicled in Lisbon in a famous literature of shipwreck. The English company, the Dutch company's great rival, had launched early in the century a ship called the Trade's Increase, the largest merchantman England had ever built. and she had come to grief on her first voyage east, careened and burned in Java, an omen that London merchants remembered. And in the very years the Batavia was rising on her stocks, the ambition of kings was producing the same pattern in warships. In Stockholm, a Dutch-trained master was building for the King of Sweden a warship called the Vasa, taller, more heavily gunned, and more gorgeously carved than anything the Baltic had seen, and she would capsize and sink in a home harbour within the first hour of her maiden voyage, in the year before the Batavia sailed. Drowned by the same forces of pride and haste that were quietly at work in the Dutch fleet. England would launch her sovereign of the seas within the decade, gilded from stem to stern, so costly that the taxes raised for her helped stoke a civil war. There was something in the age itself, a conviction that magnificence could be built and sailed, that scale was an argument, and the Batavia belongs to that family of arguments. She differed from her sisters in one respect only. The Vasa was killed by her own design, the trades increased by worm and misfortune, the great carracks by overloading and the sea. The Batavia was sound. Her builders had done their work honestly, her hull was strong, her design proven, she was, of all the doomed giants of her generation, perhaps the best made, and her destruction required no flaw in her at all, only a mistaken reckoning, a trick of moonlight and the men she carried. That is her peculiar place in the long line, the great ship whose fabric never failed, wrecked by navigation and then betrayed by her own company. And it is perhaps why her story unsettles where the others merely sadden, because it locates the danger not in the timber but in ourselves. Her loss also left marks on the world that outlasted the grief, and some of them can be traced on any modern map. The company did not abandon the southern route. It was too fast and too profitable, and ships kept running east before the westerlies for as long as sail endured. But the Batavia's fate, following earlier scrapes and followed by later ones, pressed the Dutch into taking the Southland seriously as a hazard, and the charts of that coast grew steadily less blank through the century, filled in by ships blown too far or sent deliberately to look, until the western face of the continent. Its capes and reefs and island groups was a mapped Dutch coastline in everything but settlement, named end to end with Dutch names generations before the English ever raised it. The Abrolhos themselves went onto the charts with their warning attached, and skippers gave them sea room, and other Dutch ships were nonetheless lost along that coast in the decades that followed, each adding its own scatter of coins and bones to the shore, so that Western Australia would eventually hold in its shallows. A little fleet of the company's dead, with the Batavia, the eldest and darkest of them, their names deserve a moment's telling because they and the Batavia belong to one story, the long toll the Brouwer route took of the ships that ran it. A generation after the Batavia, the Vergelderek, the Gilt Dragon, struck a reef further south along the same coast with treasure aboard. Scores of her people reached the shore, a boat carried word to Java, as the Batavia's longboat had done, and the rescue ships, searching that immense coastline for months, found wreckage but never a living soul. So that her survivors simply pass out of history on the beach, a company of the vanished about whom Western Australia still wanders. Decades later, again came the Zoetdorp, outward bound with a great lading of freshly minted coin, which disappeared without any word at all. Only in the 20th century was her fate read from the land itself, from coins and relics found at the foot of the towering coastal cliffs that now bear her name, where she had evidently driven ashore, and where signs suggest at least some of her people survived the landing and lived for a time above the wreck, joining Luce and Pelgrim in the role of Europeans whom that coast absorbed without receipt. And there was the Zevik, lost in the southern islands of the very same Abrolhos, a century after the Batavia, whose castaways camped for the better part of a year among the islands, found relics of earlier wreckage as they salvaged and, in the end, built themselves a new small vessel from the bones of their ship. The first ocean-going craft ever constructed in Australia, and sailed it to Java, completing the voyage their ship could not. Each of these losses left its own scatter of coin, iron and story along that coast, and when the divers of the modern era began their searching, the wrecks were found within a few years of one another. The Batavia's discovery lending method and momentum to the rest. So that Western Australia came almost at once into possession of a whole submerged archive of the Dutch Sea Road, 4 great ships spanning a century of the route, and the museums that hold their recovered cargoes display them together. A fellowship of the reef, in which the Batavia is at once the oldest, the best preserved, the only one whose tragedy owed more to men than to the sea. This sideways manner, the wreck belongs to the founding story of a nation that would not exist for centuries. The first European buildings on Australian soil were raised by her castaways. The first Europeans to live and die on the continent were her marooned criminals. The first European children born in that country, for at least one child, the records suggest, was born to the company of survivors during their ordeal, drew first breath among her islands. None of it was intended, all of it was suffered. And Australians have long since taken the strange inheritance into their history books, where the Batavia stands at the very beginning, before the famous navigators, before the colonists. A story of arrival that no one would have chosen and no one can now remove. For the Netherlands, the lessons were bookish and quieter. Pelsert's printed journal, appearing in Amsterdam under a title that promised the unlucky voyage of the ship Batavia, became one of the celebrated horror tales of the century, reissued and pirated, its engravings of the wreck and the gallows pored over by readers who would never smell salt water. Moralists mined it for sermons on greed and godlessness. The company mined it for procedure, tightening its rules on the stowage of arms, the conduct of merchants and skippers, and the discipline of survivors, in the dry conviction that catastrophe is best answered with regulation. The deeper questions the story raised about how quickly the ordinary customs of decency can be dismantled when a persuasive man controls food, water, and fear, about how many people will consent to terrible things by degrees, and about why resistance formed where it did, among common soldiers on a bare island. With no officer above the rank of their own stubbornness, those questions the 17th century mostly declined to ask in such terms, and left waiting in the documents for later ages which have asked them insistently in histories, novels, operas and plays, finding in the islands a small, dreadful laboratory of human nature. But all of that lay far ahead. In the meanwhile, the century rolled on, the company grew and flourished, and in the fullness of time decayed. Roads of empire shifted, and the Batavia herself passed out of living knowledge entirely. Her position recorded only loosely in old journals, her islands visited by nobody but sealers and fishermen, her name surviving as a book on a shelf, until even the certainty of where she lay dissolved, and she became what the great wrecks always become when the last witness dies, a story without a place, waiting in the dark under the shine of the sea. And yet places remember, even when people forget, and the Abrolhos, through the long silence, kept their evidence with the indifference of stone. The islands were never quite empty of human traffic. The people of the Australian coast had known those waters far longer than any European. Sealers worked the island beaches in the early colonial decades, taking skins by the thousand. And from late in the 19th century, the islands acquired a small hardy industry of guano diggers, mining the accumulated centuries of seabird droppings for fertilizer. Followed in the 20th by fishermen, for the shallows of the Abrolhos hold one of the richest cray fisheries in the world, and camps of lobstermen took root on the very islands where the tents of the castaways had stood. These visitors kept turning things up. Guano diggers on the high islands found the low stone walls and puzzled over them, and found too, from time to time, human remains and old-fashioned objects on the small island to the south, relics that were noted in colonial newspapers, connected by the learned to the old printed tale of the Batavia, and then largely set aside again, because the 19th century had no way to do much more with such things than wonder. The wreck itself stayed hidden. The reefs of the Wallaby group all look alike from a boat. The coral had had 3 centuries to build over the timbers, and the old Dutch positions were too vague to guide a search, so that even people who worked those waters every season and knew the story well could pass their whole lives within a few miles of her and never know it. What changed everything in the middle of the 20th century was the same invention that changed the fate of every shallow wreck on Earth: the diving mask, and the compressed air lung, which for the first time in history let ordinary people descend and stay and look. A generation of Australian divers and fishermen took to the water along that coast after the Second Great War of the century, and among them the old Dutch wrecks became a quest, fed by finds of coins on beaches, by fishermen's tales of cannon seen in the shallows, and by the researchers of a few obsessive amateurs of history who combed the archives for sailing directions 3 centuries old. The Batavia came back to the world in the southern winter of 1963. The finding, as so often, was a braid of luck and persistence. Crayfishermen, working the Wallaby Reefs, had come upon wreckage. A party from the mainland town of Geraldton, divers and enthusiasts among whom the brothers Max and Graham Kramer are especially remembered, followed the reports out to Morning Reef. And on a calm day in June, almost exactly on the anniversary of the wreck by the old calendar's reckoning, they went down into the surge and found her, unmistakably her, a field of shaped grey stones lying in ranks. The portico of the castle of Batavia stacked as her hold had held it, with bronze guns green among the coral, iron anchors like sleeping animals, and everywhere cemented into the reef. The dark concretions that divers learn to read as buried iron and silver. A journalist and diver named Hugh Edwards, who had chased the Dutch wrecks for years, helped carry the news, and the find became a national sensation, for Australia understood at once what it had been given, the oldest chapter of its European story lying intact in 10 feet of water. The sensation had its ugly side, as sensations do. The technology that found the wrecks could also loot them, and the early years of Australian wreck finding were marred by souvenir hunting and by ruinous methods. On the Batavia's sister wrecks especially, that destroyed as much history as they lifted. The alarm this raised did lasting good. Australia moved, over the following decade, to place the old Dutch wrecks under legal protection, and the legislation born of that alarm became a foundation of historic shipwreck law, cited and imitated far beyond the country, so that the Batavia, having already given Australia its first buildings and its darkest founding story, helped give it, 3 centuries on, its tradition of guarding the drowned past. Then came the archaeologists, and with them the ship's strange resurrection. Through the 1970s, the Western Australian Museum mounted seasons of systematic excavation on Morning Reef under maritime archaeologists whose work there, led for many years by Jeremy Green, helped define the young discipline itself. Working in surge so constant that divers were sometimes swept from the site, gridding the reef, lifting the coral overburden with patient care. They mapped and raised what 3 centuries had left. The guns came up, bronze and iron, the anchors, thousands of artifacts, that museum tables slowly sorted into the furniture of 17th century lives, coins in their thousands, apothecary jars that may have been the property of Cornelius' own trade, navigational instruments, the surgeon's gear, cooking pots, combs, and the small personal seals and spoons by which individual owners could sometimes be named. The portico was raised stone by numbered stone, and when it was assembled ashore it stood complete, a Renaissance gateway, the height of a house, which today frames a doorway in the museum at Fremantle, so that visitors walk through the very architecture the ship was carrying when she died. And, most remarkably of all, part of the ship herself survived. Where the stern had settled, the stacked stones and ballast had pressed a great section of the hulls after planking down into the coral sand, sealing it from the worms, and the excavators found it there. A sweep of the transom and the port quarter, planks, frames and fastenings in place, the actual oak of the Amsterdam yard. Raising it took enormous labour, timber by tagged timber. Conserving, it took longer still, years of treatment to replace the sea salts in the wood, and reassembling it produced at last the centrepiece that stands in the Fremantle galleries now, the dark curved wall of the Batavia's own stern rising above visitors in the museum quiet. The only substantial remains of a Dutch return ship anywhere on Earth, and one of the very few places in the world where a person can lay eyes on the 17th century's greatest machine, not as a model or a painting, but as itself. Visitors who stand before that stern describe a common experience, and it belongs in the chronicle because the ship's encounter with the living did not end in the 17th century. The gallery keeps its light low for the timber's sake, and the whole section rises out of the dimness at an angle, dark, immense, and unmistakably a made thing, the planks carrying still the tool marks of the men who hung them, the tree nails and bolts in their patterns, the curve of the tuck where the planking sweeps up under the vanished galleries, and people speak of the sudden collapse of distance, the understanding, arriving all at once, that this is not a representation of the story, but a piece of it. Wood that heard the lookouts shout. Nearby stands the assembled portico, and cases hold the human rack of the wreck, the coins, the instruments, a bronze gun, the great cameo that went out to tempt an emperor and came back from the sea to a display case, and, presented with the gravity the subject demands, evidence of the islands themselves, so arranged that visitors may choose how closely to look. Further north in Geraldton, the port that faces the Abrolhos, Sister Museum keeps its own Batavia galleries with finds from the wreck and the islands, and glass there frames the sea in the direction of the reef itself so that a person can look from the relics to the horizon that hides their origin. Between them the two museums receive, year upon year, the descendants of a nation the castaways never imagined, schoolchildren by the busload. For the Batavia sits in Western Australian schooling, much as founding shipwrecks sit in the memory of other sea-facing peoples, and the curators report the perennial questions of children, which are the right questions: whether the people were scared, whether the dog survived for the record notes animals aboard, why the bad man did it, and the perennial silence of adults before the stern, which is also a right response, and perhaps the rightest. The islands gave up their own testimony more slowly, and are giving it up still. On the small island, the survivors named Batavia's Graveyard, known on modern charts as Beacon Island, and long occupied by fishermen's camps, human remains began to surface almost as soon as people dug there at all. A skull turned up by early visitors, bones found under hut floors and water tanks as the crayfishing camps grew. From the 1960s onward, these finds were treated with increasing care, and in recent decades, the island has been the site of one of the most careful forensic archaeology projects in the Southern Hemisphere. The fishing camps were eventually removed altogether and the island returned to the dead. Teams from the Western Australian Museum and partner universities surveyed it with ground-penetrating instruments and excavated grave after grave, and the graves bore out the old confessions with terrible fidelity, single burials and mass burials, men, women, and children lying together, remain showing the marks of blade and violence exactly where the depositions of 1629 said they would be, and remain showing no violence at all, the dead of thirst and sickness from the first desperate days. Forensic workers have reconstructed faces from some of the skulls, given ages and diets and old healed injuries to individuals, and matched at least a few, tentatively, against names in the muster books, so that the anonymous dead of the islands have begun, at a distance of nearly 4 centuries, to recover something of their personhood. An act of quiet restitution that the archaeologists involved have described as the real purpose of the work. On the high islands, meanwhile, the walls of Weeby Hayes's men have been surveyed, protected, and left standing in the wind as they were found, low rings and lines of lifted stone that a passing eye could mistake for natural pavement and that a knowing eye cannot look at unmoved, the oldest European structures in Australia, built as a wall against their builder's own countrymen. The wells still hold water, the wallabies still graze around them. The whole group of islands is protected now, managed for its fisheries, its seabirds, its history together, and visitors who make the long trip out from Geraldton by boat or light plane describe the same discovery the castaways made, that the place is beautiful, glitteringly, peacefully beautiful, and that the beauty sits very strangely on the story. The ship, too, has had a second life beyond the museum cases, and it is one of the gentler chapters of her chronicle. In the 1980s, in the new Dutch town of Lelystad, on land that had itself been lifted from the sea within living memory, a master shipbuilder named Willem Vos set out to build the Batavia again, full size, in oak, by the methods and to the forms of her own century. As an act of research, the project took a decade. Young apprentices, many of them taken on from unemployment, learned the dead trades alive again, hewing frames with adzes, steaming planks over open fires, twisting rope in a long rope walk, carving the lion for the bow and the giants for the stern from wood as their predecessors had done. The archaeologists of Fremantle corresponding with the builders of Lelystad so that the drowned original could correct her daughter across the world. The new Batavia was launched in the 1990s before enormous crowds, with the Dutch royal house in attendance, and she floats today at her wharf in Lelystad as the centrepiece of a working historic shipyard, visited by hundreds of thousands, her rigging climbed by trainees, her great cabin walked through by schoolchildren who are told and age. Suitable measure, the story of her name. Those who have sailed in her report what the reconstruction was built to teach, how such a ship actually moves and sounds, the enormous quiet of her below decks under way, the labour of her gear, the strange gentleness of a hull that sighs in a seaway. And between the museum stern in Fremantle and the living ship in Lelystad, the two halves of the world that the Batavia's story joins, the original and the replica, hold between them nearly everything that can now be physically known about the great return ships. So that scholars of the period travel between Australia and the Netherlands to study one vessel that exists in two forms, the dead and the living, on opposite sides of the earth, which is a kind of resurrection that no other ship of her age has been granted. What remains at the reef itself is peace of the sea's own kind. The excavations ended decades ago. The site is protected, marked and visited by permit, mostly by archaeologists monitoring its condition and by the occasional diver come to pay respects. Morning Reef looks as it has always looked, a pale seam in the blue where the swell stands up and breaks, turns working the white water, the shadows of rays crossing the sand channels. Below in the surge, the shapes that were left in place are softening year by year under new coral, an anchor, ballast, the timbers too deep or too fragile to lift, and the sea keeps over them its perfect, patient neutrality, the same neutrality it kept on the night of the moonlight and on every night since. Divers who have worked the site speak of it the way people speak of old battlefields, of the difficulty of holding the history and the tranquility in the mind, at once the water so clear, the fish so unconcerned, the light coming down in moving bars onto the place where the lookout's shout came too late. And it is here, over the reef, with the ship found, the dead named, the walls still standing, and the daughter vessel afloat in Holland, that the chronicle proper of the Batavia comes to its end. And what is left is the quieter work of reflection, the questions the story leaves in the mind when the facts are all told, which deserve, like everything else in this history, to be taken slowly. The reflection begins, as it must, with the sources, because everything told in this chronicle rests on a foundation of paper, and the paper has its own story. The bedrock is the journal of Francisco Pelcert, together with the trial records bound up with it, the interrogations, confessions, sentences, and inventories set down at the islands and at Batavia, a body of documents preserved in the Dutch archives and remarkable among the records of the age for its completeness. It is also, and this is worth saying plainly, in a chronicle that has promised honesty, a document with interests. Pelcert wrote as a man whose career, and perhaps whose neck, depended on how the story read, and generations of historians have gone through his account, weighing what he emphasised and what he passed over quickly, his own illness, the decision to leave in the longboat, the failure to master Jacob's earlier. And the confessions themselves were taken under the procedures of 17th century law, which included torture, so that scholars handle their details with the care that such origins demand, checking each statement against the others and against the physical evidence, and finding, it should be added, that the record holds together far better than most. Around this core lie the other witnesses, the letter of the Prix de Camp Bastiennes, written from Java in a grief that still comes off the page, company's administrative correspondence, and the popular printed versions that began appearing in the 1640s, and that mixed the documents with invention, beginning the long afterlife of the story as legend. Then for 3 centuries the file effectively closed. Its reopening in the modern era was itself a work of quiet heroism. The name that deserves first mention is that of Henrietta Drake Brookman, a Western Australian writer who in the middle of the 20th century became convinced that the accepted guesses about where the wreck lay were wrong. The old finds of relics had fixed attention on the southern islands of the Abrolhos. Drake Brookman, working through the Dutch documents, having them freshly translated and matching Pelset's descriptions of islands, distances and wells against the charts, argued in print that the Batavia must lie among the Wallaby group in the archipelago's north, and it was precisely there, within a few years of her prediction, that the divers found a ship. A triumph of armchair scholarship over received opinion that maritime historians still cite with affection. Since then, the story has been served by 2 generations of professional scholarship, the archaeology of the museum teams, the archival histories, of which the most widely read modern account, by the historian Mike Dash, drew the Harlem background of Cornell Eyes into full light, and the forensic work on the island graves. And it says something about the tale's depth that each generation has found genuinely new things in it, as though the reef was still giving up wreckage. For all this labour, honest gaps remain, and a chronicle that respects its listeners should name them rather than paper them over. The largest hangs over the skipper. That Arian Jacobs plotted, Mutiny with Cornell Eyes, is the consistent testimony of the confessions that he deliberately eased the Batavia away from her consorts after the Cape to free the plot's hand is asserted in the record and believed by many historians. But Jacobs himself never confessed. No court ever convicted him of it. And the possibility remains that the separation was the ordinary work of wind and current, and that the navigation that followed was mere error rather than error in the service of design. The numbers too are honest approximations. The ship's muster gives something over 330 souls embarked, but lists of the age miscount, and the tallies of the dead, of the wreck of thirst, of the terror, of the executions, are reconstructions that different careful scholars settle at slightly different figures, agreeing on the shape upward of 100 murdered, fewer than 125 finally saved, while declining as this account declines to pretend to a false precision. The fate of the 2 marooned men is a permanent blank. The inner life of Lucretia Jans, who left no memoir, is a silence the record cannot fill, and speculation should not. Even the ship's exact dimensions are given differently by different documents, and the builders of the modern replica made scholarly choices among them. None of these gaps weakens the story. Rather, they are part of its texture, the honest grain of a history assembled from what salt water, fire, time, and human interest have allowed to survive. And the listener drifting towards sleep may take a certain comfort in them, in the thought that even so thoroughly documented a tragedy keeps its private rooms, its questions that will never be answered now, resting undisturbed like the last silver chest under the fallen gun. What then does the Batavia leave with us, when the facts are all laid out and the gaps all honestly marked? Perhaps the first thing is a meditation on the strange doubleness of great ships, which are at once the most collective and the most fragile of human works. Consider, one last time, everything that had to happen for that hull to exist at all. Acorns had to fall in German forests a century and more before her keel was laid, and the trees had to grow slowly enough, in soil poor enough, to make wood dense enough for the sea. Rivers had to carry the trunks down to the coast. A republic had to win enough freedom and gather enough capital to found a company. The company had to develop, over decades, the designs, the yards, the trades, and the trained hands. Hemp fields in the Baltic, iron mines in Sweden, flax in Flanders, tar forests in Finland. All had to send their produce along protected sea lanes to one harbour. And hundreds of men, most of whose names no record kept, had to give a year of skilled labour to a single object. All of that The compressed effort of a whole civilization and half a continent was concentrated into one wooden body 160 feet long, and one misjudged glimmer of white water in the dark undid the whole of it in a quarter of an hour. Shipwreck has always gripped the human imagination beyond its statistical share of tragedy, and this may be why, because a ship is the largest thing a society knows how to lose all at once, and the sight of one on a reef is the sight of accumulated human effort meeting, in a single place, the indifference of the world. The builders always knew it. That is the quiet dignity that hangs about the old yards and the old trades, the knowledge that everything they made so carefully was made for an element that owed it nothing, and the persistence of the making anyway, generation after generation, ship after ship, is one of the more honourable stubbornnesses in the human record. The second thing the story leaves is harder, and it concerns what the islands revealed about order, the invisible cargo that every ship and every society carries without weighing it. The people of the Batavia did not bring law with them, onto the coral in any material sense. Law is not a thing that floats. What they brought were habits, deference to rank, the custom of ration and counsel, the assumption that murder is answered, and the story shows with terrible clarity both the strength and the thinness of such habits. For weeks they held among frightened, thirsty people on a bare island, and it is worth honouring that, the first camp of Batavia's graveyard, with its guarded casks and its buried dead and its prayers, was civilization continuing by pure custom, with no power on earth to enforce it, and then the story shows the habits being dismantled deliberately by a man who understood them from the inside, and the dismantling took so little, the weapons gathered in under a reasonable pretext, the boats secured, the strong sent away, the council packed, each step small, explicable and consented to, until the day came when consent no longer mattered. Against this, the story sets its one great counterweight, the island of the soldiers, and the balance it strikes there is the moral of the whole chronicle, if a true story can be said to have one. What held on the high islands was not rank, for Hayes had none, nor force, for they began with none. It was something more elementary, the refusal of a group of ordinary men to accept that the new order of things across the water was an order at all. They fed strangers who came to them on rafts. They kept watch for one another. They built with their hands walls, and the walls held. It is not sentimental to notice that the oldest European structures on an entire continent are a monument to that refusal, or that they were built from the plainest material on earth by the plainest men in the story, or that they are still standing. And the third thing is quieter than either, and it belongs to the sea and to time. Every human intention in this chronicle was overturned. The company intended a trading voyage and got a legend. Cornelius intended a kingdom and got a rope. Pelsert intended a rescue and presided over a judgment. The stones in the hold were intended for a gateway in a fortress city, and they stand today in a museum on a coast their masons never heard of, framing a door through which schoolchildren walk. The ship herself was intended for 20 years of service and got 9 months, and yet, by the accident of her wrecking, she has outlasted every sister that served her full time and came home and was honourably broken up, for it was precisely her burial in the coral that preserved her stern to be raised and stared at 4 centuries on. There is something in this pattern that the old chroniclers would have read as providence, and that a modern mind may read simply as the deep unpredictability of consequence. But either way, it counsels a certain humility, and perhaps, for a listener at the edge of sleep, a certain peace. The worst of the story was real, and this telling has not pretended otherwise. But the worst of it was also brief, a few weeks on a few acres, while the rest of the story, the growing of the oaks, the raising of the hull, the long recovering of the truth, the patient naming of the dead, the rebuilding of the ship by young hands in a new century, stretches across 400 years and is taken in full, a story about care, about the human habit of building, tending, recording and remembering, which has so far outlasted every attempt to make the world otherwise. The sea keeps its neutrality, the coral keeps growing, and the people keep coming back to the reef not to take anything now, but to look and to remember, which is the gentlest thing that can be done at a grave. So the chronicle draws to its close, and the closing asks only that the story be gathered once, gently, into a few final images, the way a long day is gathered at its end. The Batavia herself lies where she has lain for nearly 4 centuries, on Morning Reef in the Houtman-Abrolhos, off the coast of Western Australia, her recovered stern standing in the museum at Fremantle, her portico framing a museum doorway, her guns and coins and instruments resting in their cases in 2 cities. Her daughter and namesake floating whole at a Dutch wharf on the far side of the world. Of her people, the record closes as records do, unevenly. The dead of the islands lie mostly where the Terror left them. In the coral soil of Beacon Island, their graves found and honoured now, some of their faces reconstructed, a few of their names restored. The guilty ended on the gallows of Seal Island and Batavia, or in the company's chains, or on a nameless beach. The survivors dispersed into the company's world and the long anonymity of ordinary lives, carrying what they carried. Y.B. Hayes marched out of the story with his promotion and was lost to history in the crowd of the company's soldiers. Lucretia Jans lived long, married again, and kept her own counsel to the end. The wells the soldiers found still hold sweet water, the walls they built still stand, and what the story leaves, when all its freight is unloaded, is perhaps simpler than everything that has been said about it across 400 years. It leaves the knowledge that human beings built out of oak and hemp and arithmetic, moving structures the size of palaces, and sent them around a planet they had not finished measuring, and that this was a thing of genuine wonder, whatever else travelled in the holds. It leaves the knowledge that the order people live by is a made thing too, planked together like a hull out of habit and consent, stronger than it looks in some weathers and weaker in others, and that it is kept afloat when it is kept afloat, not chiefly by the great, but by the ordinary, by soldiers who share water and stand their watches. And it leaves for those who like their histories to end at the water's edge, the long line itself, the procession of builders reaching back before the Batavia to the carracks and the treasure fleets and the grain ships of the ancient sea, and forward from her through the tea clippers and the iron hulls and the great liners to the ships passing somewhere over the horizon. At this hour, every one of them an act of faith performed in a material world, every one of them crewed by people carrying their whole natures aboard with their sea chests. The Batavia's place in that line is secure and singular, the magnificent ship to whom the sea itself was almost kind, and whose story is told, and will go on being told, not because her timbers failed, but because they did not. Because she delivered her people alive to the islands, and left them there to show the world what it hoped and feared to know about itself. The last image, then, is not the tent or the gallows, for the story does not belong to them. Let it be the reef, in the late light of an ordinary evening in the southern autumn, the sea gone quiet, the swell standing up over the coral in a long pale seam, and falling and rising again, and falling. With the terns going home overhead, and the low islands lying like shadows on the water to the north and below the surface, in the moving green light, the shapes under the coral growing slowly less distinct, an anchor's arm, a curve of ballast mound, the grey stones that were meant for a gateway, all of it settling by imperceptible degrees into the reef that has held it so long, patient beyond any human patience, keeping the ship the way the sea keeps everything it has decided to keep, quietly and completely and forever. The water darkens, the seam of foam goes faintly luminous under the first stars, and somewhere far to the north a modern ship's lights cross the horizon, standing safely out to sea, passing the Abrolhos the way all ships pass them now with open eyes. If this long voyage has kept you gentle company tonight, and if you would like more of them, more great ships raised, sailed, lost, and remembered at this same unhurried pace, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel, so that the next chronicle can find you when you are ready for it. Until then, may your own waters stay calm, may your reckonings hold true, and may you rest as quietly as the old ship rests, under the slow lights of the southern sea. Sleep well.